Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to today's Reddit Quickie from the subreddit HFY, called Conditions as Before, written by Legal. The link to the original will be down below. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Conditions as before. Come on, buddy, why is today any different? Nothing has changed, Rick. Joe sighed as he looked out of the window across the rolling sand dunes before him. The sun was just starting to rise, and while for some it might be a beautiful sight, all it did for him was make the tracks slowly being created beneath the sand all the more evident. Procedure indicates station status updates shouldn't be duplicated an excessive number of times, as indicates state and monotony, which is conducive to depression. Joe rolled his eyes at the station computer, answered his questions like that. What's excess then, Rick? He asked and glared at the small cloud of sand being spit up by a nearby dune. Excess, adjective, more than necessary, normal, or desirable, or moderate. Would you like me to use it in a sentence? The computer queried, as Joe groaned and tilted his head back. I didn't mean... Joe sighed and shook his head a moment. Frick, Rick, I don't have any fricking clue how long I've been here. Why, doesn't matter. Is anyone ever going to read these station updates? Joe tilted his mug up on his desk a moment and let it drop and watched it slowly wobble around as it settled down. I read the station updates, Joe. I value your input as a station director. Rick replied, which made Joe roll his eyes once more. Sometimes he wondered if Rick would be more tolerable if they hadn't given him such a friendly personality. Rick, I don't think it matters. You don't even know how long I've been here. I have no idea how long the days or years are here, compared with standard Earth time, and you can't even tell me how many local days I've been here. It could be 20 years for all I know. Joe waved a hand at the ceiling. That is illogical. I am unable to sync chronological records due to the gate failure, but I am confident that it cannot have been more than 3 years, as this exceeds the contract parameters set for your tour of employment at the station. For contact to have been lost in excess of 3 standard Earth years would be a breach of contract against several articles within the workplace rights laws. Joe rubbed his hand across his face, and Rick helpfully pointed that out. Rick, time since gate failure in local solar system revolutions, he tried. Error. Chronological records compromised. I cannot ascertain the data. Joe just nodded since he already knew the answer. I should have been carving the days into some damn walls of this place, he muttered. That would have denoted unnecessary destruction of company property, Joe. I would appreciate it if you didn't do that, Joe, because I would hate to have to write you up for any infractions. Joe leaned forward in his chair then, carefully clearing his mug and plate to the sides of his desk. He then smacked the face against the surface with a thunk. He slowly repeated this, with a steady series of soft thumps echoing around the room. May I inquire as to your current behavior, Joe? I am trying to break the desk in half with my face, came the muffled reply, following another soft thump. Considering the material composition of your desk and the material composition of your face, it is unlikely that you will be successful in less than... Error. Chronological data corrupted, time frame not found. Joe set his face against the desk and groaned softly into it, leaning back and scratching his head. Rick, if you can't tell the time, how do you know my station logs have been duplicated an excess number of times? He looked up to the ceiling and he hoped that would somehow shut the computer up. I count the individual logs, Joe. You have duplicated the entry. Conditions as before, 2,000 times since the last unique log entry in which you claimed that the status was great and everything was better, and then you announced it was April Fool's, and I noted this as being inconsistent with chronological records, as they say could not be synced due to the gate failure. Joe pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed. Frick, has it been that long since April Fool's? I needs to happen again. Fine. Finally relenting, realizing that it would be worse if he just didn't give in. What would you like me to say for the status logs today, Rick? There's nothing more that I would like than the truth, Joe. Honestly, in a workplace of cornerstone of a healthy work environment, as such I have no input on what I would like you to enter for the status. But data indicates to improve a personal rut, it might be beneficial to examine one situation with fresh eyes. Why don't we just start with the conditions that are the same as before? Joe just looked at the window as he watched the sand move around still. Well, the giant arsehole is still circling the station the same as always, waiting for me to step outside so that he can eat me, because that fat frick didn't get enough by eating everyone else who fricking worked here. Joe then raised a single finger to salute to the moving sand in the distance. For the sake of clarity, could you please be more specific, Joe? I do not show any station records resulting matching a specific designation of giant arsehole or fat frick. Is this a reference to the indigenous species, perhaps? Joe rolled his eyes and he glared at the ceiling. Yes, Rick, it is in reference to the indigenous species. He clipped his words a bit as he wondered just how the busted the computer was these days. I do not show any entries in the database for indigenous species of giant arsehole or fat frick. Is it possible that the species in question has another name? Joe groaned as Rick asked, and he stood up and waved out the window. The fricking sand snake, the giant sonic worm piece of crap that ate the others 50 fricking years ago, or whatever the frick it's been, and then camped outside the fricking station waiting for one more tasty human snack. Well, you're not going to eat this human. Do you hear me? You kitty crap. Joe screamed at the window and then took a heavy breath as he watched the disturbed track on the nearest sand dune settle before another puff of sand shot up in to spite him. Joe, it is unlikely that the creature can hear you from inside the station. Furthermore, any communication seems problematic as it is unlikely the species possesses the sapience or intelligence levels necessary to carry out a meaningful verbal communication. Joe just pressed his hand against his face as he slowly dragged it down, pulling his lower lip along with it for the moment, letting go as his lower lip snapped back into place. Thank you, Rick. Very informative. He replied instead of screaming, though he wanted to. You are quite welcome, Joe. Are any of the other aspects of the station still the same as before, Joe? It is best to keep complete records in the logs. Rick continued as Joe finally pulled himself away from the window to start walking back into the rest of the station. Yes, just about everything is the same, he mentioned as he walked out of the office and into the common area that had been set up for a hub of the mess hall of sorts. He had left some food out to try and make the place feel more lived in. It didn't work, but now he kept it out for the entirely different reason. Rick, this food still hasn't rotted. Carefully he poked the authentic hamburger and saw the dent left in the bun with his fingers slowly rising back into place. None of the food that he had set out looked any worse than when he'd first opened up the rations packets that they were in. That disturbed him. The station was cleansed of any foreign bacteria before assembly on the planet. Necessary decomposition is caused by bacteria. Local forms of bacteria are kept at a minimum due to the environmental scrubbers. It is likely that the local bacteria has not developed the necessary structure to decompose this particular foreign element. On Earth, there was a period when trees did not properly decompose for an extended period of time for similar reasons. Rick informed him, Yeah, that sounds like some bullcrap. I'm fairly sure that this isn't food, and it's merely just food-like product that never rots, and is a super carcinogen, or something, like pure cancer. He muttered as he nudged the chocolate chip cookie with the little food tray. That is simply not possible, Joe. The company would not wish to feed their employees any unnecessary carcinogens, and such as an action would also be illegal. The company would not wish to break the law and treat its employees unfairly. The company values you, Joe. Joe rolled his eyes as Rick said that. Yeah, they sure do, which is why I've been stuck on this fricking dirtball for a century. Or more, he grumbled and headed out to the main pod, along with the hall towards the central tower. The company cannot be held responsible for the gate outages, as there may be circumstances beyond their control, Rick pointed out. We make the gates, Rick, Joe reminded the computer. While this is true, there is still may be circumstances beyond the control of the company, as seen in the multiple forms of gate regulation and legislation across international... Yeah. Joe waved a hand dismissively as he opened up the hatch and stepped into the central tower of the station. This was where he spent most of his time anyway. The hab and rec modules were both here. Perhaps the one benefit of being stuck here alone was that he didn't have to share the rest of the hab module with anyone. He turned half into a pillow fort for when he wanted to ignore Rick. The rack module consisted of a single room with a couch and 2 armchairs. The vidscreen was filled with several thousand movies and TV shows. Tucked into the corner was a pinball table that he had still never beaten on a high score on. Finally, there was a ping-pong table, but he had no one to play with, since Rick wouldn't let him move the automated arm from the mech bay in here. Also, he doubted that he could do that in the first place. Research indicates that sometimes the best way to take a fresh look at one's situation is to literally view it from a new point of view. Perhaps you should enjoy looking at the oasis from the observatory. Rick suggested next. The top level was the observatory, but since the windows had broken when things went to hell, he'd never went up there during the day. "What's the temperature right now, Rick?" he asked as he looked at the ladder leading up to the observatory hatch. "The early morning forecast is 48 degrees Celsius, with highs today expected of 58. Lovely clear skies all day." Joe rolled his eyes as Rick mentioned the skies. "I've told you I'm not interested in anything over 50, Rick. And while you don't remember a lot, I know you remember my temperature scale," he muttered as he shook his head and walked past the observatory ladder. No way he was going up there. "I'm afraid that I do not find the hot as balls to be a very specific scientific measurement," Rick replied. "It's simple. 50 to 54 is hot as balls, 55 to 59 is hot as crap, and 60 plus is as hot as a fat cokehead's crack on the dance floor." Joe explained, and the computer once more. "Duly noted, Joe." Rick's easy reply made Joe scoff as he moved to the central tower to the comms unit. From here, he could hear the gentle hum of the machinery in the next few towers. That kept the entire station operational. Not to mention processed local materials from the oasis into food and water for him. He preferred it to the ration packs anyway, probably because it was slightly less cancer-filled than the processed stuff. Slightly, hopefully. Joe just sighed as he looked at the various consoles and panels and all the red lights. No messages, no long-range comms, no porn, and still no way to track the worms. Between the sand itself, the damaged gear, and the nature of the shells or scales, or whatever the frick the worms had, it was almost impossible for him to use Rick to track them. He could spot them easily with his eyes, but that wasn't all that helpful if he wanted Rick to warn him about its position. The best that he could do was proximity alerts, and all that really told him was that the fricker was currently eating a station, or not. Currently, it was not. Find a way to turn the local veggies into computer chips yet, Rick? I have not been successful in the endeavor, no. I am not led to believe that this avenue of research will be particularly promising still, Joe. But I shall continue it as best as I am able to, even though it exceeds my occupational programming. Joe just nodded, and the computer loved to try and temper with his expectations. "Well, I appreciate it, friend." Joe reached out to give the nearest console a light pat, as if that already meant anything to Rick. "Everything going well with my piece of cake?" He glanced through the sealed hatch to the life support tower beyond. The tube connecting the 2 towers had been cracked, so he left it sealed. "Based on your reviews on the past local ingredients, the current cake will likely be most associated with chocolate, banana, and honey. It shall be ready tonight at the usual time," Rick assured him. "Sounds great, pal. Well, I'm heading to bed." Joe took a look through the hatch at the sun-filled tube beyond. There was no point in him being awake right now. "Are you sure, Joe? That would leave no human personnel on the station if there's an emergency during the daytime operations. This is against protocol." Joe just sighed as he walked back towards the central tower. "Rick, you ask me if I'm sure every day. And every day I remind you that I am the only one left. So I have to sleep at some point, and I choose to sleep during the hottest parts of the damn day." "Sound good?" he asked as he sealed the hatch into the central tower, just to be safe. "Sounds good, Joe. Sleep well, Joe. I hope conditions improve." Rick lowered the lights for Joe as usual. "Me too, bud. Me too." Joe muttered as he sat down on the edge of his bed and pulled his shoes off. He used to sleep in the buff, but all it took was one emergency where he had to run to the life support tower naked to put a stop to that. He just unzipped the arms and legs of his jumpsuit and opened them up a bit and stretched out on his bed. Rick, white noise, Peruvian cafe. Slowly, he could hear the indistinct chatter in the background. He didn't know French, but he didn't mind. He just liked the way it rumbled together. He closed his eyes as he pictured some quaint little coffee shop with a view of the Eiffel Tower. Then again, according to the bids, every building in Paris had a wonderful view of it anyway. But to drift off to sleep, he had to remind himself that he needed to get up and go to class, or he'd miss the exam. And with that, he drifted off to sleep almost immediately. Things were peaceful as he sat and he enjoyed the view. He had a baguette with some wine, and everyone around him was attractive, which is nice. The coffee wasn't burnt, and the overall everything was very pleasant. Right up until the annoying siren began going off. Was that the French cop sirens sounded like? It was very loud and very annoying. Where were the cop cars? Then he watched Godzilla stomp towards the Eiffel Tower. Why was no one reacting to this? He turned around in his chair, looking for some sort of recognition. Parisians around him just ignored the giant lizard as he grabbed the tower and began to rip it apart, causing the cafe to shake. Rick! Joe jostled up out of his bed as he felt things shaking around him. Joe, it seems the indigenous species has collided with part of the station structure. I am analyzing the damage right now, Rick explained. Fricking worm! Joe groggily yelled. Life support? He asked, half asleep and entirely bleary. All life support systems are fully operational. Damage seems to be minimal. Food processors and oasis extractor equipment fully operational. Minor damage to ancillary systems, Rick announced. Good. Going back to sleep, Joe muttered. Joe, protocol after station damages. Back to sleep, Joe growled. Deactivate the alarm, re-engage the white noise. As usual, falling back asleep was even easier than going to sleep in the first place. But this time he didn't really envision much this time around. When he finally did wake back up, he yawned and stretched as he sat back up. Rick, did I dream it, or did the station get hit? The station suffered some minor collision with damage with an indigenous species of considerable size impacting it during the day. I have prepared a full damage report for your convenience. Rick helpfully replied, Yeah, sure, give me a minute. Joe rubbed his forehead and brushed his eyes with his thumb as he got up and shuffled over to the bathroom to get a cup of water from the sink. And then he dumped a mixture of local oats from the small bucket into the same cup. He filled it with hot water next to make some sort of oatmeal, which he let sit. Before he stripped out of his jumpsuit, tossing it into the dirty hamper, and took out a sonic shower mixed with a bit of spare water, allowing himself 20 liters before he cut it off. He knew that he had far more than that available in the station, but he never took chances. Once he was out and dried off, he pulled the new clean jumpsuit before picking up the cup and slurping out the oatmeal. Gulping it down, a soggy mixture wasn't especially pleasant, but it was filling, which was what mattered. Besides, he was about to enjoy the absolute best part of his day, as he set the glass back down and he made his way to the life support tower. Once he reached the comms tower, Rick spoke up again, though. Would you like to review the damage report now, Joe? In a minute. He waved it off again and glanced out at the hatch to see the crimson rays of dusk pouring through the cracked tube. Exterior temperature? It is currently 45 degrees out, with lows tonight expected to reach 30. Rick informed him. So much more tolerable, Joe muttered as he opened the hatch and he felt the sudden heat bathe over him. He gasped softly and he scurried through the tube quickly to reach the other tower. As he entered the next tower and sealed the hatch behind him, he let out a sigh of relief as the climate-controlled air enveloped him once more. He looked around the life support equipment and then headed down to a set of stairs and around more machinery to reach the food experimentation lab. This was where they were supposed to have the working on all sorts of new ways to use the local crops for settlers that would have eventually arrived. It was mostly shut down now, but there was one machine that he kept on so that Rick could experiment away. The cake machine. It wasn't really a cake machine, but Rick had discovered a way to make flour and process some fruits into sugars and other flavors, and once a day Joe got to enjoy a piece of cake. He was fairly sure he'd have gone mad long ago without his daily cake. Salivating in anticipation, he reached forward and opened up the door on the spot where the cake should be awaiting him, and found nothing. He closed the door and then opened it once more. Still nothing. He closed it once more and then touched the machine to make sure that it was there. Then he touched his face to make sure that he was also still there. And then he looked around and tried to read to make sure that he wasn't stuck in a dream, because he remembered being told once that he can't read in dreams. He could read. Rick. What's wrong, Joe? I sense distress levels in your voice, Rick asked, full of concern. Rick, there's no cake. What's wrong with the cake machine? He asked as he looked over the various lights. As I was trying to tell you earlier, Joe, the collision during the day disrupted ancillary systems. This includes the equipment that I use to process flavorings of the local ingredients into more advanced foodstuffs. Damage is focused around the Oasis food collectors, so, until further notice, flavor will not be added to the locally sourced foods. But the good news is that your sustenance shall continue unhindered, albeit without the flavorings and spices that you've come to enjoy. Joe just stared at the empty cake machine ahead of him for a moment. Then he let out a scream and knocked everything off the nearest countertop. He then turned to smash the glass vial onto the floor, just as his scream enraged. Rick was trying to talk to him, but he ignored it as he rushed out of the lab and onto the nearest window. Looking up at the station towards the Oasis, he spotted the multicolored puff of smoke over the sand dune and pointed. Freck you, worm! Eat my team, destroy the comms equipment, leave me with no way to know how long I've been stuck here in this freaking dirt ball. Fine, but take away my cake, and you've gone too freaking far. Joe, I am sensing heightened levels of... Rick started, but Joe just screamed over him. It's freaking on, worm. You might have thought that it was on before, but now it's so much more freaking on. You have no freaking idea. I will murder the crap out of you and eat your freaking heart. He rushed to the next hatch, ignoring the heat as he moved into the mech bay, which he almost never used because the mechs were fairly slow, and the worms could just eat them, and it was all he had. Joe, you seem to be suffering from acute emotional distress regarding the state of the flavoring enhancement of your sustenance. I assure you that if there are no further collisions, the equipment can be repaired in, error, chronological records damaged, time frame not found. That's what I was freaking afraid of, Joe hissed, sliding into the ladder down the heart of the mech bay. I'm killing that worm, and I don't care if it's the last thing I do anymore. I just don't freaking care. It dies. Joe, what little information I have on the species that collided with the station implies it is of significant size. It is unlikely that any of the mechs provided by the company would be able to battle such a creature, Rick reminded him. Yeah, but the company didn't make these mechs for me, now did they? It makes a lot of mechs for a lot of things, military things for example, like the Ursus mech, right Rick? These things was made for the military, this one just doesn't have the guns. He pointed at the squat mech suit before him, that was fully enclosed. That is the civilian variant of the military model, which the company does not produce for the military, yes, Joe. However, the power cells of this module are far inferior to that of the military model for safety reasons. This mech is only designed for construction use. It is not rated to engage hostile indigenous life forms in melee combat. This would likely void its warranty, Rick helpfully pointed out. Yeah, and it would just eat me. Joe thoughtfully tapped his chin as he looked around the mech bay. He already knew the surveyor poles were too small to do anything to the worms. He needed something big. His eyes came to rest on one of the relay towers that lay outside of the mech bay, unused after all the years since the worms and the gate malfunctioned, ruined everything. It had one hell of a point to it, and he knew that it could extend support arms on command. Rick, can this mech lift the relay tower? No, the relay towers are designed to be moved by a crawler with crane equipment, Rick reminded him. What if he looked around once more and his eyes came to rest on a tunnel that led down to the submerged reactor? What if I took out one of the shards from the reactor core? The military tech is built to use shards. That'll boost the power capacity, but it's like a lot of percents. He had not been hired for his engineering skills. What he knew now came from years of dicking around with things while bored. Joe, moving a shard without proper protective shielding is not recommended. Furthermore, to use a shard without proper coolant is also likely to end in a catastrophic explosion. It would also reduce the estimated power life of the station from 20,000 years to error chronology. Joe waved off Rick's usual error message. Yeah, like 15,000 years. Huge reduction. I'll be dead. Not my problem. Would it be enough power? I could figure out a way to house it in one of the coolant cells. Maybe just stuff it full of the spare mech coolant. That'll last 15 minutes, 10, he wondered. At that point, power supply on the mech would be the limiting factor, as the mech servos are designed to not lift items sufficient weight due to damage to the mech. Joe tapped his chin as Rick threw another issue at him. That's right. Those stupid safety governors, so we didn't damage the mechs doing stupid stuff. Joe nodded as he remembered that. But, if I were to wire the mech to that nerve sensor thing in the med bay, could I strap myself into it and make it think that I'm a mech, and that mech is me? And, as a human, I could ignore the burning horrific pain that it would likely incur to lift something like that, and throw it at the worm. He clapped his hand and formed a basic plan. Joe, to wire your own nerves into the mech as a sort of feedback system is not only a terrible idea, because it would almost entirely remove the point of using a mech to lift things beyond the capability of the average human, but also a terrible idea, as it would no doubt lead to severe nerve damage from the pain that it would cause you as you took the stress of lifting something that exceeds the mech safety governors. Rick didn't hold back. Oh, come on, Rick. This is an Absolute Dynamics mech, and I'm Absolute Dynamics employee. They hire only the best, and they make only the best. We can do this. You always say how great the company is. He tried to get the computer on his side. I must be entirely and completely honest with you, Joe. Rick started, which made him arch a brow. Are you not always honest with me? He asked the computer, feeling slightly concerned. I am, but now I'm most especially honest with you. Just because the company is so great does not make it capable of feats beyond the realm of possibility. I would also not like to see you come out of this harmed, as this would leave the station entirely unstaffed, and this is the only way that it could be less optimal than with a single living staff member on the station. Joe just nodded and shrugged. Well, I appreciate what concern you're allowed to show, but this is how it's got to be, Rick. This is a culmination of my life. All the skills I've learned will be put to the test here, and those skills will get me through this to the next victory. He grinned. I am unsure what skills you possess that reply directly to this situation. Rick replied, still keeping it real it seemed. I'm not sure either, buddy, but that's why we're gonna see how it goes. But tonight, I build a mech to kill that fricking worm, once and for all. If ever there was a time I needed you, Rick, it's now. I need to see what spare parts we've got for me to spruce up the mech. Bus schematics, so that I don't weld the wrong place, or use the wrong wires, or stuff. Also, if you have any skills that I don't know about, I wish you could play music. I would so be badass heavy metal mech montage music. He began to head to get the welding gear to get started when Rick surprised him. Understood musical request. Holy crap, did that work? How have I never asked that? He gasped softly, wondering how he'd never tried asking Rick to play music before. Closest match found, K-pop dance routine workout mix. With a poppy Korean music began to fill the mech bay. Wait, that's not... Joe started, and then let out a heavy sigh before he shrugged. Frick it, I can work with this. With that, Joe set to work on the mech bay to improve the mech with which he would finally kill the worm. It took him all night, and he had several small fires, several cuts, and plenty of K-pop dance breaks. But in the end, the mech was ready. He could override the safety governors. He'd extended the arms and set the housing on the back of him to fit the modified power cell into. He'd used up all the coolant before it shut down to prevent the shard from going critical. All that remains is to get the shard, he muttered, as he looked at the tunnel leading down to the reactor. I would still prefer you didn't attempt this, Joe. Even the limited exposure to a fully primed shard while underwater is likely to reduce your life expectancy by half. Aren't you supposed to try and figure out how many years that is and have an error message, so that I can be left with a feeling of comfortable in the vague warning that I can't fully comprehend? Joe asked as he looked up at the ceiling with the mech bay. No, it is likely to reduce your life expectancy by half. That's what it says. I can show you if you like, Rick cheerfully offered. No, that's okay, Joe muttered, and he took a slow breath as he steeled his nerves. The sand snake had taken his cake. It must die. He picked up the modified power cell containment unit and headed forward into the tunnel as it began to angle down into the ground. Here, the station came to the edge of an oasis where the water was used to house the submerged reactor. He really didn't know much, or any, of the tech behind the shards, but he knew they were crazy powerful and needed to stay nice and cool. The water was cycled not only to keep it cool, but further protect him from whatever it did to people. More cancer, likely, but different cancer. This was advanced cancer-giving stuff, void cancer. An airlock separated him from the water as he stepped inside. He grabbed a mask and a rebreather, which he fastened on nice and tight, before activating the cycle. When the water started to pour in, he was expecting an icy shock, but really it was very nice, like a sort of lukewarm bath, maybe. Hugging him gently as he began to swim deeper into the reactor, everything was bathed in a soft blue light as he reached the reactor itself and entered the codes to disengage one of the shard housings. Whatever he had been expecting when the shielding retracted, he wasn't sure, but this wasn't it. The blue turned to purple as he was bathed in the most intense out-of-body experience of his life, as if he were watching himself watch the shard from somewhere else. He could suddenly see things, purple things, but Rick's warning thankfully echoed in his head, and he shook it off as he moved the containment unit up, careful not to dare to touch the shard himself as he locked it into the makeshift power cell and snapped it shut. With that done, he swam back to the airlock and cycled back into the air. Draining the airlock took much longer than flooding it, and he spent this time peering through the tiny viewing slit at the shard within, wondering how many hours, or days, or weeks, or years he was cutting off of his life by doing this. Then again, the snake must die. And what did he really have to live for anyway, without cake? Once the airlock finished its cycle, he was left to finally tear his eyes from the viewport and move back into the medbay. As the station did not explode, I take it the transfer was successful, Rick mentioned. It was, pal, Joe replied as he got to work snapping the power cell into the back of the mech. He considered drying off, but he knew that the sun would be coming up soon, and didn't think that he had time for it. So he climbed into the mech, sopping wet still as he strapped himself in. Joe, what little research I have been able to do indicates a very high probability of failure for the situation, but I do hope that you succeed, because I value you as a co-worker, Joe, Rick carefully mentioned as he no doubt tried to keep Joe's office morale up. I hope it works too, buddy. Joe was busy strapping himself in. When he powered the mech up, he felt strange. It didn't feel like a true extension of himself, but it was like his arms and legs were much longer than they should be. He took a few small steps forward and then stepped out into the sand. When he looked up at the moment that they admired the vast cosmic display above him, as the tiny exterior lights of the station could hardly dampen such a massive display. Sometimes he forgot how beautiful it was. And then he heard a distant rumble and a screech as it reminded him that the stars could wait. He had an indigenous species to murder. He wouldn't have the proper stability to toss the relay tower in the sand. He'd jump up onto the food extractor housing, but he needed to get to the tower first. Walking out of the bay proper, he dragged one foot, and then hopped with the other one a bit, and then he took several small steps, then a big jump forward, all the while watching the dunes for the telltale signs of the worms. That's right, I'm not walking with a rhythm, you big stupid fricking worm. And you don't know what the frick I'm doing, do you, dummy? He asked as he reached a row of relay towers, most of them half buried in the sand after years of neglect. He grabbed the closest one, and then he lifted it up, gasping as his arms began to burn a bit under the strain. Maybe shoulda done testing, he muttered before lifting it up. He couldn't afford to move slowly this time. He'd have to rush. But take me alive, you son of a bitch, he hissed out as he then scurried back towards the station, dragging the tower with him as he heard the rumbling through the sand behind him. Then he reached the food extractor housing. He hopped up onto it, landing with a heavy metal screech. The housing groaned for a moment, but it didn't break as he looked back and saw the tracks through the top of the nearest dune as the worm came to investigate the disturbance. That's right. Come and find me, you stupid overgrown parasite. His arms strained hard as he tried to shift the tower around in the mech's arms. Throwing it like a javelin was impossible, if he was going to have to try and underhand lob it at some massive log. He waited until the brilliantly colored smoke of the worm gave off just as the crest of the dune. "Show yourself!" he cried out, and waited until the fat pinkish tongue stuck out of the sand a moment. Taking a few hesitant steps back, he started to run forward, his arms and legs now screaming at him, in burning pain as the nerve feedback was transferring the stress over the exerting the servos to him. A fat worm-like head stuck out of the sand a moment, its eyeless face wiggling around. "Yes, right there," he cried, as he lobbed the tower up into the air, watching it slowly tumble through the sky, end over end. The worm began to dip back into the dune. "No!" He stared at the dive down. "No, no, no, no!" He then watched as a part of the midsection stick up into the air so that it could dive deeper. "Right there!" he cried out as the tower at its point sank deep into the worm's flesh. "Yes!" he cried out, hearing it let out a pained screech as it wiggled to try and sink away from the attack. But he slammed the button for the tower's legs, which snapped out with a small explosive bolts to better sink into place, and the gory red explosion of the worm's flesh chunks. The creature was cut in half. "Frick! Yeah!" Joe cried out happily and nearly jumped, which would have likely sent his mech tumbling off the station housing. Then he heard the warnings blare at him as the coolant ran down and quickly opened up the mech hatch to shut it down to prevent the overheat. But he didn't care. He just laughed and clapped his hands as he stood on the lip of the mech cockpit. "Take that! I win, you lose. You thought that you could wait me out. Think again on behalf of my kick and also my fellow station employees. Revenge is mine. You thought you could wait me out and eat more sweet human meat? Well, think again, motherfricker. I am the superior species. I am the king of the fricking desert. And you," he firmly flipped off the corpse with both hands, "are fricking dead." He couldn't help but jump up and down and pump his fists in the air with pure exhilarating victory. Unbeknownst to Joe inside the comms tower, the relay tower came online and the gate sync light flickered green for 3.8 seconds, and then turned red again. What was known to Joe, however, was that he laughed and clapped so he could hear something rumble. The splintered rays of the sun were creeping over the dunes as the day began, and he saw a few brilliant puffs of smoke in the distance. His laughter stopped, and the smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of horror as the clouds not only got closer, but came from two directions. No. There was a screech, soon echoed out by another, and he saw two trunks moving through the dunes towards the corpse of the slain worm. "No!" he groaned out, hands gripping his hair tight. "No! There were 3 of you fat fricks. That's why it seemed like you never slept or went away this entire time, you stupid sack-sucking, inbred, moronic, lactose-intolerant jerks. That's not fricking fair." He then let out a fineless, wordless scream just as the station lights flickered as Rick tried his daily sync-in with the gate right on time. By the time the computer booted back up, the 2 worms were nosing around the corpse of the 3rd, either eating it or pulling the halves away from the relay tower that he'd cut in 2. "Joe," Rick's voice echoed out over the station's exterior PA. "I am unable to sync with the gate, and I am detecting damage to various personality, memory, and chronological components. I see that I have left myself a note to engage in long-term station log inputs to get back up to speed more quickly, and shall begin that now. I also left a special note that yesterday might have been different. Would you like to update me on any changes in the log before I begin the systems check?" Joe was silent for several seconds as he slowly sat down, legs dangling out of the edge of the mech cockpit. "Joe, can you hear me?" the computer asked. "Yes. Yeah, buddy, I can hear you," Joe finally replied. He felt tired, more tired than he'd ever felt in his life. His arms and legs burned, but mostly he felt exhausted. "The station log, Joe. Any updates?" the computer checked. "No, bud." Joe took a slow, deep breath and then let out a ragged sigh. "Conditions as before."